folks can straggle in as they will. I'll do. This is our second week talking about the Native American tribes, and not only here in Kansas, but also as they were treated across the United States during the last couple hundred years. So, you can't read the board. I apologize, the marker was sub-center, but that same information is on the top of page 2 of the new handouts. So do not distress. In doing this study for this class, the thing that impressed me, well, I talked last week about how the overriding principle that whites had treated Indians about his land, they had it, we wanted it, we took it. Also, the idea that the Native American tribes, as badly treated as they've been for the last 200 years, they still endure. They still survive. They've hung on. It's a testament to human character to be treated as badly as they have been and still endure and are somewhat revived now. They'll never be out like it was, but they still endure, and they, despite everything we threw out.
You're fine.
It's estimated that when the first European explorers came, there were between 5 and 10 million Native Americans in what's now the lower 48 states, does not count Alaska. 5 to 10 million. They don't know for sure. It's really hard to pin down. There's no question that by 1900, that 5 to 10 million had gone down to under half a million. So you can see what happened over just 100 years. Well, actually, 400 years. I think it was interesting, the term Indian, of course, Columbus thought he'd come to India. And so everybody saw was over here was an Indian. And you're an Indian. Well, he wasn't even close to Indian, of course. American doesn't work either. It's named from an Italian navigator who never got to North America. He sailed all over South America, Americo Vespucci. And so a German geographer picked up his name and thought, well, we'll just call it All America. So the Canadians, as I mentioned, they have it right. They call them First Peoples. And that's the best way to do it, but we don't do it. So American it is. Since 1778, the entire destiny of Native American tribes here has been determined by the government, one way or another, good or bad. And like no other ethnic group in this country. For example, if you were, imagine you were an Irishman coming to this country in 1840, or the German in 1850s. You got off the boat, they might have checked you for gross health problems. After that, you were on your own. You do what you wanted to, go where you wanted to, get a job, whatever. Nobody was looking over your shoulder. Nobody was telling you where you had to live or what you had to do. There wasn't anybody giving you handouts. You were on your own. Native Americans, on the other hand, every step they've taken has been dictated by the government, good or bad. And as you get farther along, we can see how it sort of progressively gets worse. The first period we got there is well, I didn't make these up either, the so-called treaty making. And that lasted about 50 years. And that was not a bad time for Native Americans. It wasn't great. A lot of the damage had already been done to the eastern tribes, especially. The tribes that first had contact with the Europeans got decimated by things that we don't even think about today, like measles. They had no immunity, and sort of killed whole villages. The Wampanoag tribe was the first one to meet pilgrims and had the first Thanksgiving with them in 1620. By 1680, they were gone, essentially gone because of disease. Not because the whites took their land, because they just got too close to the whites and couldn't do it. Anyhow, the treaties were made by the United States government, and they were by and large honored. Although there was still some fighting, especially in what area known as Northwest Territory. That was the first big expansion of the United States what we now think of as Ohio, Michigan, Indiana. That was the area where there were tribes that were familiar enough for those of us who were in Kansas, like the Potawatomi and the Kickapoo and the Miami. That's where they came from originally. They were back there. And there were some pretty sharp little fights between the tribes back there and the settlers who came in and settled wherever they wanted to. But that was the exception more than the rule, because there was plenty of land. It wasn't really the pressure for demand for land yet, there would be later on, especially with the Louisiana Purchase having been completed by Thomas Jefferson in 1803. That opened up a whole lot more land. And so places like Illinois and Missouri and Iowa could be settled, and there weren't that many Native Americans here to start off with. Somebody asked me last week, I can't remember who it was, but somebody asked me, do we have any idea how many Native Americans there were in Kansas, in the area now known as Kansas, say in the year 1800, before the whites started coming out here? And it's really hard to say. Maybe no more than 80,000, which is basically one person per square mile. Kansas has 80,000 square miles. So one person, so very, very thinly populated. And even then, the western tribes following the buffalo up and down the western half of the state, Cheyenne, Iowa, they didn't have permanent villages, so they were here sometimes a year, sometimes not. So it was not very, very thickly populated at all. Farther east and south there were, that Georgia and New York State, there were bigger towns, permanent towns. There weren't many folks out here. And it got less as time went on, of course. So anyhow, the treaties were made and broken and made again. But by and large, it was not a bad time for the Native Americans compared to what was going to be pretty soon later on. That started really with in the 1830 period. They had the Relocation Act that was Andrew Jackson pushed it through. And it was aimed at the tribes in the southeast. And these were bigger tribes, settled tribes, Cherokees, Choctaws, Creek. And they had land in Georgia and Alabama and Mississippi, especially with the growth of cotton. It was prime cotton producing land. And the slave interest wanted it, and so they needed to get the Native Americans out. It did not help that in 1830, gold was discovered. America's first gold rush. Very brief gold rush, but it was a gold rush down in North Carolina. And that was an impetus to get people out of there, one way or the other. And so by 1830, they passed a law that said, well, I'll tell you what, we're going to give you new land in what's called the Indian Territory, now known as Oklahoma. And we'll let you move, but you got to move. You don't have a choice. And so there was tribes resisted. The Seminoles were one of the 5 tribes that was targeted. They were farther south in Florida, and a lot of them said, no, we're not going to go. And we'll just go back to the Everglades, and you won't get us out. And they didn't. They were the one tribe in the entire history of the lower 48 that never surrendered, never submitted to the U.S. government. And that's why, here's a little tidbit, Native American mascots. Most of them have been done away with because they're stereotypical, prejudicial, racial. Florida State. We're the Florida State mascot. They're the Seminoles. How did that happen? Well, it happened because of 2 things. The Seminole tribe takes it as an homage that they were never defeated by the United States government. Also, Florida State did away with the stereotypes in the brave and that kind of thing. They also have a deal where it worked out. If you remember the Seminole tribe, you get a scholarship to Florida State. So they put monetary attachments to it. So the Seminoles have said, fine, you can keep the name Seminole. North Dakota, on the other hand, was fighting Sioux. They had to give that up because that was still, it was just too stereotypical. So some of them got to keep them, some of them didn't. And there were high schools, of course, all over the country. They had to give up their mascots too. Shawnee Mission North, for example, for many, many years was the Indians. Now it's the bison. So Manhattan is still the Red Indians for some reason. I'm sure they held on to it, but I think they were still the Indians.
question about treaties. Did the concept of treaties come from Europe? Or did the indigenous people have concept of treaty and how that?
No, we talked about that last week. That's a good point.
I'm sorry.
They, yeah, the European concept was, okay, you draw a line, this half is ours, that half's yours, by treaty. Native Americans had no concept of land ownership. So the idea that this is our land, this is now your land, but you can't come on our land now because it's ours. That just didn't, and also when they made treaties, a lot of times they didn't know who they were making them with. They'd have a couple of Native Americans show up and say, I'm representing the X tribe, and they'd sign a document, make their mark, get some trade goods, and go off. And then later on, the real chiefs of the tribe would hear about it and go, wait a minute, we didn't do that. That happened in the southeast a lot. The Cherokees, the main leaders of the Cherokee tribe would go, we didn't sign off on this. We never agreed to this. And they said, wait, here, you did too, right here. No. So the whole concept of treaty was like a square peg in a round hole. It didn't mesh with what the Native Americans were used to or understood. And by the time they caught on, it was too late. And you have governments come and say, well, we're going to take your land whether you want it or not, treaty or no treaty. And we'll get to that in a little while here when they get into the post-treaty phase. But initially they would sign a treaty and we would reduce the land that the Native Americans had, but they were still guaranteed their land. And by and large, those were upheld because they didn't have the pressure for the land. The Great Immigration did not start to hit the United States until after the War of 1812, 1820s, 1830s. Then the Europeans started coming over here big time. So, and there was always Canada. Tribes could move back and forth around the Great Lakes and upstate New York. They could go back and forth to Canada, which was basically empty. There was hardly anybody up there at all. So tribes could do that. That was an outlet, a safety valve for them. And period 1778 to 1830, there really wasn't anybody out here in Kansas that was trying to get the land. So the tribes in Kansas, the Kansa, the Osage, the Pawnee, they weren't really affected by any of that. They knew that the whites were there. They were starting to come out into, especially into Missouri, and trade, but they never. There was no pressure to take the land from the Native Americans out here. That changed in the next period, 1831 to 1871. Then you start getting the large-scale movements. I mentioned the Southeast. The tribes get moved to Indian Territory, and then you also had it in the Northeast, Ohio, Michigan, Illinois, Indiana. They got moved out here, Kansas and Nebraska. And we're talking, when I say move a tribe, I'm talking about 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 people all at once. And railroads made that possible. Before you had railroads, it was hard to move that many people. But once you got railroads, you just load them up and call them out, and that was it. The return would have been a couple months. Trip took a couple days. And so they were put out here and given land. I think it's illustrative. When you look at the back page of your handout, and you hand out, this is not Kansas, it's Oklahoma. And I'm sorry it didn't come off better. It's online, it was in color, and it was really striking. But you've got the white areas there. Those are the areas that were not covered by some kind of treaty at all. So you've got basically Panhandle and the northern part, and then the very southwestern part. Everything else in Oklahoma was covered by some kind of treaty. And those treaties are still good to this day. And you've got down at the bottom, there are 37 different Native American tribes that were relocated to Oklahoma. That's why when you go down there and drive along I-35, or it'd be 35, you can't throw a rock and not hit a casino, because they're all entitled to casinos under the Indian Gaming Act. 37 different tribes. And the upper corner, up here in the northeastern part, you've got an insert there. There are a lot of tribes that have just a little piece of land. Not enough to live on, but it's typically theirs. But the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, they have big chunks of land. And those were given to them by the government under this relocation concept. Kansas was the same, but most of the tribes of Kansas got moved out a second time, and they're not here anymore. And there were 8 original tribes in Kansas. We talked about it last week. 4 in the eastern half were more settled. The Kansas, who we're right now where we're standing. Pawnee to the north, Osage to the south, and Wichita along the Park River. And then there are the more nomadic tribes to the west that followed the Buffalo, Cheyenne, Kiowa, Arapaho, and Comanche farther south. They're all gone. They all got moved out. So all the natives and Americans or tribes that are here now weren't here 100 years ago. And all the ones that were 100 years ago are here now. So again, that's the government action in work, at work.
So all of those treaties were established before the land grab in Oklahoma.
Oh, yeah. The land, we'll get to that a little later on. That was part of the, yeah, well, we had a Kansan was involved with that, oddly enough. We'll talk about Charles Curtis in a little while. So anyhow, relocation, removal, just a whole bunch of things. Annexation of California, we talked about last week, that opened up the West. Once they started having railroads come through, that made transportation easy. Homestead Act was passed in the middle of the Civil War. Very interesting. 1862. They had enough faith in the future of the country. They passed the Homestead Act to basically come out here and settle it for I think 5 years and improve your claim. You get 40 acres, and it can be yours. And so free land. That was, of course, whose land was it? Well, it wasn't the government's land. It was the Native Americans' land. But after they got moved out, it was now free land. So the government had handed it out. And there were some, obviously, conflicts. Some, mostly all, were not initiated by the Native Americans. George Custer got his first round of fame after he was a boy general in the Civil War, but then he got reduced from general back to colonel. And in 1868, he came to Pawnee camp of Cheyenne. They were settled down for the winter on the banks of the Washita River, which is in western Oklahoma. And they call it a battle. I put battle in parentheses, in quotes rather, because when you have one side doing all the shooting and the other side doing all the dying, it's not really a battle. And that's what it was. And Custer afterwards asked if it was a massacre. He said, no, we didn't kill them all. So he found out a few years later what the other side was like. So then some of them, like Sand Creek, that was in eastern Colorado. That was a militia group that went out and did the same thing to, I think, Arapaho. So it was, the pressure was there and it was building year by year. The Washita raid was interesting enough. There were the Cheyennes who had been put down in reservations in Oklahoma, and also the Buffalo were getting killed off. They did a raid across central Kansas in the summer of '68 and got as far north as Medicine Lodge and then got turned back. And that was what prompted Custer to go after the Cheyenne. Except the guys who were after weren't there. He got women and children instead. So eastern Kansas, the Kansas got moved out. They first got moved farther west. They opened up land for the Miamis and the Wyandottes and Delawares and Shawnees to come in here, where we're standing now. And then later on, they got moved down to Oklahoma. Eastern tribes have been all gone by 1871. Ones that were here now came from farther east, the Potawatomi and so forth. And I don't know, I could not find out why they are still here. What exempted them from being removed down to Oklahoma like everybody else. But for some reason, they stayed here. It may well be the land they were on, nobody wanted, which they said let them keep it. Potawatomi, the reservation, if you look on a map, it's the big one. You can see north of Topeka, between Topeka and Holton. It's 120 square miles. basically a square. Looks impressive. If you look at it more closely though, less than half of that land is actually owned by Native Americans. Over half of it's owned by whites. Got sold off back in the days when the reservations got opened up. So, and that's actually not too bad. There's a reservation in northern Montana, well, actually southeastern Montana, the Cheyenne Reservation. It's 7 times bigger than the Potawatomi one here is, and it has 12% of the land. It's owned by Cheyenne. 12%. The rest of it's owned by white ranchers. So the reservation concept really, it looks good on paper, but it's not really, it got destroyed over time. So the assimilation era really began with the Indian Appropriation Act of 1871. And it basically said, no more treaties, we're not gonna make a treaty, the tribes don't have any legal existence. You can't make a treaty with somebody that doesn't have legal existence, so no more treaties. That was the end of the treaty era. And then basically were reduced to wards of the federal government. They had to live where the government told them to, they were given food, maybe, if the Indian Asia didn't steal it first. And some of the tribes in the north especially had enough, so they said, we're not doing that anymore. And so you had the Battle of the Bighorn, and what people don't remember, they remember the Bighorn. Within a year, Sitting Bull and his people had to flee to Canada because the government came down on them with both feet. And it was in the southwest, the Apache, and they did a bit of a fight, but they were all subdued eventually. Eventually, all the tribes in the 448 had been subdued. Alaska's a different story. We're not going to talk about that today. They got added too late. Really, nobody wanted the land up there anyhow, so there was no real pressure to get them. You couldn't put them anywhere anyhow. There was no place to push them in Alaska. Down here, they got moved around. So what happened was you get moved, everybody would get moved to a reservation. And the idea was we could make farmers out of these people, even though they have no training to be farmers. We're not going to give them the equipment to be farmers. Being a farmer is hard enough in this part of the world anyhow, with the weather being the way it is. You know what you're doing. And if you don't know what you're doing, it's a recipe for disaster. It just will not work, and it did not work. In addition to that, once you got on the reservation, then you were dependent on the government for your food supplies. And then the government came along, or the churches came along and said, we want to educate your children. We're doing you a favor here. We're going to get them assimilated into white society. And oh yeah, if you don't want to do that, then no more food for you. So, surprisingly, they had a lot of children get sent off to these Indian schools. And the Presbyterians had them, as a lot of most of the denominations did too. And they were different setups, but the theory was basically the same. The slogan was, kill the Indian and save the man. So no more cultural differences, couldn't use the native language, had to use the